What a beautiful morning and what an interesting venue to speak in. The theme of my brief speech this morning is Buffalo coming back? And how does focusing on mission make a difference? I am a family doc. Along with my wife Joyce, in 1997, I started Jericho Road. And I want to just tell you a little bit about my story and weave it into the story of Buffalo. I was born in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. My parents were Amish, as were my wife's parents, horse and buggy and pretty much the whole 9 yards. When I was 3, my father and mother moved to Belize in Central America, and there they were Mennonite missionaries. My dad was a church planter, my mom was a full-time mom, and we lived there until I was 14. Back then I didn't know anything about Buffalo. In fact, the only thing I remember growing up in Belize that jogged my memory about Buffalo was one time reading a Newsweek cover story in the 1970s with a picture of snow that was over the roof. And I had never seen snow as a kid, and I was just amazed by, what this was like. Never to imagine that someday I'd be in Buffalo myself. What really impacted me in my time in Belize was being exposed to medical need. I often traveled with my dad. He tended to take people to the hospital. We lived in a pretty remote area of Belize. And so I remember being along with him when women were delivering in our van, snake bites, all kinds of medical stuff. And I got this burning desire to be a doctor, which wasn't really a dream that a young Amish Mennonite kid should dream about, because we weren't really allowed to go to high school, college, much less medical school. But long story short, I got to medical school, and it was here in Buffalo. And when I came to Buffalo, I was pretty naive to how the poor were treated in this country. I had grown up pretty sheltered, Amish, Mennonite community, Christian schools outside of the country. And when I got here to Buffalo, it was really my first exposure living in the community on the west side and going to medical school at the way the poor were treated, especially in our healthcare system. Basically, if you had real insurance, you never saw a medical student or a resident. You got care somewhere in a private practice somewhere far away from ECMC. If you have Medicaid, you often would see me, who had very little experience, and you might have to wait 4 or 5 hours to see someone, and it'd be someone different every time. And if you had no insurance, you probably just went to the emergency room when you really, really needed care. And out of that experience kind of changed my life. I thought I was going to be a doctor and go to another country where the need was real. But I realized that here in Buffalo there was need, and so decided to, after residency, come back to Buffalo and start Jericho Road. I want to just tell you a little bit about Jericho Road. It's not really the topic of my conversation this morning with you, but we started Jericho Road in '97 as a family private practice, and the mission was, and really still is then, to provide quality care to anyone who needed it, regardless of insurance status. Like, we wanted our focus, our intention was to go against the grain, and instead of having this broken up system, to be able to treat anyone, whether it was, the president or a refugee or someone with no insurance, the same way. And that was our mission. It wasn't easy at first. A couple years in, I remember our practice consultant coming to me and sitting me down and look me straight in the eye and say, "Myron, you need to sell. This is not working." And we kept going. And maybe 3 or 4 years later, he said, "Well, you're seeing lots of patients, but you're seeing way too many Medicaid patients. You need to figure out a way to get more people with private insurance." And we went back to our team, and we came back and we said, "We are really busy and we can't see everyone, but what we're going to do is stay focused on our mission, and so we're only going to see folks who are new refugees, people who are pregnant, or people who have no insurance." And we lived that out for a couple years. And gradually, as we focused on our mission, Jericho Road grew against all the odds. You're not supposed to do this kind of thing in the current healthcare system, and yet we grew. And today, we have 30 doctors and nurse practitioners. We have a staff of over 300, and we take care of many, many people here in Buffalo. We do medical care. We run a homeless shelter for undocumented and asylee seekers called Vive. We do a lot of community programs that address the social determinants of health, and we even are following refugees back to their countries and doing global health work. But I'd really like this morning to talk about Buffalo. I think, you know, Joyce and I have raised our family now. We have 4 children. They've grown up here in Buffalo. We love Buffalo. And, you know, on a morning like this, a beautiful morning like this, talking to most of you, I think we probably all, some of us at least some of the time, we say, Buffalo's coming back. Look at the canal side. Look at the restoration of the Richardson Psychiatric Center. Look at Hotel Lafayette. Look at the Buffalo Medical Corridor. Look at all the people that are coming back to Buffalo. But the truth is, and I say this because I've been here for a while now, 22 years, working with folks on the west side and east side of Buffalo. The truth is that Buffalo's story is pretty complicated. And whether or not Buffalo is truly coming back at this point, I think is open for debate. Buffalo's story really started with a pretty great injustice. You know, originally the settlement was called Buffalo Creek, and Buffalo Creek was, by the 18th century, was home to the Seneca Nation. And the Seneca started to feel pressure by settlers, European settlers, who were coming into this area because this was a prime area back then because of our proximity to the lake. And there was tension, and so during the Revolutionary War, the Seneca actually sided with the British. And as we all know, the British lost. And as a result of that, Seneca were temporarily forced out of this area to seek shelter at Fort Niagara. At one time, there was 5,000 Seneca refugees around Fort Niagara. There was a peace agreement, and they were given the Buffalo Creek Reservation, which today is a 9-acre plot that houses the casino. But back then encompassed most of what is Buffalo today. And that lasted for a while, but that land started to look very, very enticing to European settlers. And in 1838, President Jackson, Andrew Jackson, forced the Seneca to sign a treaty which removed them from Buffalo. Buffalo is a story of immigration. Obviously, the West Side Italian folks, the South Buffalo Irish folks, the North Delaware district, this district, maybe German folks, and the East Side, and especially the neighborhood I'm going to talk about in a minute, the Broadway Fillmore neighborhood, folks from Poland. Buffalo's a story, and we'll talk a little bit this more in a minute, of race and segregation and discrimination. Buffalo's a story of then a second wave of migration of African American folks from the South coming here, and then white flight, and then today, story of folks from all over the world coming here to Buffalo. As I think about Buffalo, I think that that there's a neighborhood called the Broadway Fillmore neighborhood that probably encapsulates the story of Buffalo, its rise and its decline, and maybe now it's coming back in a good way. So I want to now transition to talk a little bit more about that neighborhood and sort of weave the story of Buffalo into it. Back in the 1850s, 60s, 70s, Broadway Fillmore and that part of the east side was basically cow pastures. What is now Broadway Avenue today was a dirt road connecting Buffalo to Batavia. But in the migration or immigration of European folks, the Polish people came from a country that was pretty discriminated against in Europe. And when they got here to Buffalo, they weren't really welcome in the other parts of Buffalo. And so they decided to create a community, a place to be on the east side of Buffalo in the Broadway Fillmore, with the Broadway Fillmore sort of being the hub. That grew tremendously and ended up becoming one of the largest places in all of the United States where people of Polish descent settled. There's a couple, if you the Broadway, you guys all probably know the Broadway Fillmore market, and maybe over Easter you guys go there and it's packed. There's so many people there. That market was first started in 1888, and at the time was located in a thriving, mostly Polish district neighborhood. At one time there was 2,000 businesses in that neighborhood, and people from all over Buffalo came to get European goods. It went through 3 iterations. The most recent structure was in 1956, I believe, was built. As you know today, it's still open, but unless you're going there before Easter, it really is a shell of its former self. There are 4 large Catholic dioceses or churches that were built in the late 19th century, early 20th century in the Broadway Fillmore neighborhood. The one that I focus on is St. Stanislaus Church on Townsend Street. This was built, I think the congregation was formed in 1876, and the church itself was built in 1888. It's one of Buffalo's architectural treasures. At the time, the first priest was from Poland and ended up being in charge for 40 years. At the peak of its glory, that parish had 20,000 people, and a school right next door had 2,000 students. Today, that church is really more of a historical shrine than it is really an active congregation, and the school has been closed. And today, people visit it because of its architectural splendor, not because of its impact in the community that it is in. And then we all know about the Buffalo Central Terminal, which was built back in, I think it opened in 1929. It's interesting that when there was, as there is in Buffalo, it tends to be controversy when big projects happen. And the controversy was that they kind of built it away from downtown. But if you read about it, the planners thought that someday Buffalo would be a city of 1.5 million people, and that downtown would stretch all the way out to where the Buffalo Terminal is today. And so the decision was made to build it. It opened, unfortunately, right in the beginning of the Great Depression, but still through the Great Depression and the World War II and into the 50s was a thriving place in Buffalo where over 200 trains would come and go every day. It was a huge transportation center for Buffalo. Unfortunately, Buffalo declined and transportation and manufacturing changed, and in 1978, I believe, the last train pulled out of the Central Terminal. And today, it is a shell of itself, but still a reminder of what Buffalo once was. As I think about those 3 sort of iconic structures that are in the Broadway Fillmore neighborhood, one of the things I think about is when they come back, maybe then that's a sign that Buffalo is coming back. So I want to just talk more specifically about some issues that are particular to the Broadway Fillmore neighborhood. Just a reminder that the Broadway Fillmore neighborhood is at the intersection of Broadway and Fillmore. North, some people say Sycamore Street, some people say Walden Street, south, Williams Street, and it goes all the way out to Bailey. And it wouldn't be, we wouldn't be really accurate to talk about this neighborhood and actually to talk about Buffalo without talking a little bit about race and segregation in this city. I've included a map that was published in the Wall Street Journal in 2015 that depicts the amount of segregation in Buffalo, which isn't changed today. Buffalo at that time was rated out of 100 cities as the 7th most segregated city. And the line of segregation is Main Street. And if you look on the east side of Main Street, the green on your map is really the concentration of African American folks in Buffalo. And another way to look at that is to look at a map of Erie County. And if you look at that map, it shows blue everywhere except for a tiny dot on the east side of Buffalo, which is red and depicting the concentration of African American folks in Erie County. And so as you think about, well, why has that happened? We need to understand that a little bit to say, well, how can Buffalo move forward to break out of some of these things that have entrenched it and caused its decline? You know, there are some, there's two sort of migrations that help to tell the story. One is the migration of African American folks from the South in the 40s and 50s after World War II. They were fleeing oppression, the reality of Jim Crow growing up in Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi, places like that. Many of our team that works for us, their parents moved here in that time. And at the same time, almost simultaneously, was the migration of white folks out of Buffalo, and specifically out of the East Side. And, you know, there's a lot of reasons for that. I'd like to focus on two reasons that I think, and actually they're both rulings. One was the landmark ruling in 1954, where it was the Board of Education, or it was Brown versus the Board of Education. And in that landmark ruling, thanks to our Supreme Court and Thurgood Marshall, it was decreed that schools need to be integrated in this country. And that eventually hit Buffalo in 1976, I believe. George Arthur and a group of folks, activists, brought a suit against Buffalo's Board of Education that we were not integrated. 29 of the Buffalo Public Schools in Buffalo had more than 80% white kids. And Judge Curtin, who just passed, ruled in favor and forced the integration of Buffalo's public schools. This was not taken well by a lot of white folks here in Buffalo. The second ruling that made law and then ruling that made a big impact was in 1968 when the federal government passed the Anti-Discrimination Act against housing. Remember, there was a lot of things discrimination that caused communities to be segregated. You know, things like redlining, where before 1968 it was legal to actually classify cities and neighborhoods A, B, C, D, and pretty much every African American predominated community was ranked as a D and was not allowed, given the same resources from banks to invest, to get mortgages. And in 1986, there was a landmark case in Buffalo where they brought against the city that they were discriminating with Section 8 housing. Basically, African American folks who qualify for Section 8 housing could only find Section 8 housing on the East Side. And that was struck down and hopefully opened up some opportunity for African American folks to be in other parts of the city, although it was still difficult. Those two main, along with the lack of manufacturing and the decline of Buffalo's sort of job opportunities, meant that many people white folks left Buffalo. Between 1950 and 2000, the Buffalo's population of white folks dropped from 97% to 50%, and African Americans rose by 433%. This has had long-standing impact on the East Side, and specifically in Broadway Fillmore District. I just want to close with giving you some demographic data about the neighborhood that we're talking about, and compare it to Grant Ferry, which we also work in here on the West Side. The population today has fallen to 7,000 people, 65% Black, 13% white, 11% Asian, and 2% Latino. One of the interesting things at Broadway Fillmore, Grant Ferry, which is where we have our original Jericho Road office, is 27% made up of folks who are foreign born. Broadway Fillmore District is now becoming maybe second or third with 15%. The annual household income in the Broadway Fillmore District is $18,000. Compared to the Grant Ferry District, it's $35,000. The unemployment rate of men between the age of 35 and 44% is 33% in Broadway Fillmore district. 30% of the folks that live in Broadway Fillmore who are over 25 never graduated from high school. And crime rates are the highest in Buffalo. If I went online to a real estate site, which is probably not the best way to get this kind of information, but they basically said the comment about this neighborhood was that it's 0% safer than any other city or neighborhood in all of New York State. Another thing about crime is that because it's a high concentration of African American folks, and we know that the criminal justice system is unfair to people of color, it means that not only is there more crimes committed in a place like Broadway Fillmore, but also people suffer more as a result of those crimes. The average household price, house price right now in Broadway Fillmore district is $22,000. And then there's all kinds of health disparities. I guess the one thing I would say is just that black folks in Broadway Fillmore are 3 times more likely to die prematurely than white folks who live in the same neighborhood. And this slide that you guys are looking at is one of my favorite slides to talk about injustice in healthcare. One of our insurers recently gave us a contract which for folks that have private insurance, we get paid $17 per month for each of them to take care of them as a population. For folks with Medicaid, we get paid $6 per member per month. That discrepancy is even in our healthcare system. And so a place like Broadway Fillmore has no doctors. And that adds to the health disparities and the suffering of the people there. The closing with this idea, and again, getting back to intention, Jericho Road has just this week opened our 3rd health center in the Broadway Fillmore district. And I think it follows our mission and that focus on our mission. One of my favorite passages is this idea of let justice roll on like a mighty river and righteousness like a never-failing stream. This idea of staying mission true, I think, is something that is applicable to all of you guys. You're starting your companies, you're trying to make Buffalo better. Stay true to your mission. Be intentional about walking it out. Be intentional about trying to look for neighborhoods in Buffalo that are still not back and doing what you can to bring them back. Jericho Road is now at Broadway Fillmore. We're helping to bring Buffalo back, one neighborhood at a time. What we do is just a drop in the bucket, but our hope is that by investing in this community, that others will follow, and that there will also be this intentionality around trying to change the underlying systemic things that allow us to have a city that has a neighborhood such as Broadway Fillmore. Thank you very much.